Welcome back to the deep dive. This time we're tackling something pretty big, U.S. trade law.
Sounds dry, but trust me, it's way more interesting than you think.
You sent over a whole stack of trade statutes.
Yeah.
And wow.
Dense stuff.
Yeah, but there's some real gems in here.
Oh, absolutely.
We're going to unpack how they put a price on that imported stuff you buy.
It's customs, yeah.
Like, how do they figure out how much that jacket you got online is actually worth? And there's that Made in the USA label.
Always tricky.
So tricky. We'll dig into that. And even how trade laws protect endangered species.
Yeah. It's a wild ride through the legal system behind global trade, really.
We're going to break it all down.
Show you the key parts, how it affects, like, international deals, even what you see when you're shopping.
Okay, so let's dive right in. First up is Section 402 of the Tariff Act of 1930.
That's the one about valuing imports.
Sounds simple enough, right? Like, how much does it cost?
But that's where it gets interesting.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Section 402, it's not just about slapping a price tag on something. It's this, like, crazy detailed formula they use.
So besides the price I see, what else goes into it?
Think about it. You've got packing costs.
Right. Got to get it all boxed up.
Shipping, of course.
Across the ocean, yeah.
And you've got taxes from the country where it was made, even...
No, it adds up.
Sometimes even royalties and licensing fees get thrown in the mix. Like, remember those designer sneakers you like?
Yeah.
Part of what you're paying for at import might be fees paid to the actual designer just for using their logo.
So those limited editions, it's not just hype. It's like international trade law in action.
Exactly. And this whole system, it's all about fairness.
Yeah.
You know, they don't want companies sneaking in cheap stuff.
By undervaluing it.
Yeah, to dodge taxes. It protects U.S. businesses, too. They don't get undercut by unfairly priced imports.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
There's a whole strategy behind pricing, huh? Now, this next one sounds kind of intense.
Which one?
The Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act of 1988, specifically Sections 1201 to 1217.
Don't let the name scare you. This act is all about the harmonized tariff schedule of the United States, putting it into practice.
Harmonized tariff schedule. Are they trying to make things easier?
That's the goal.
Okay.
To classify products for trade so everyone's on the same page. So like the U.S., China, Brazil, we're all using the same system, should make global trade smoother, in theory.
So it's like the Dewey Decimal System, but for everything traded around the world.
That's a good way to put it.
That's got to be massive.
No, it's huge and surprisingly complex.
Even though it's harmonized.
Right.
Makes you wonder what kind of arguments happen over classifying stuff. But speaking of labels, what about Made in the USA?
Yes. Section 304 of the Tariff Act of 1930, that's where it's all laid out.
Country of origin labeling.
Yep, they get really specific about what can and cannot have that label.
I've always wondered about that. What are some of the exceptions?
Sometimes it's just not practical to mark something.
Like what?
I mean, try stamping Made in USA on a tiny screw. If it costs a fortune or you damage the product, they might get a pass. Also, stuff the government imports directly.
Doesn't need it.
Nope. But where it gets tricky is, you know, things shipped in containers or products with parts from all over.
Right. Like, what if the box is made in China, but the gadget inside is assembled here?
Exactly. Tons of rules in this section for those situations, all about being upfront with the consumer.
Transparency.
You know, so you know where your stuff is actually coming from.
Makes sense. Okay, this next one had me scratching my head. Drawbacks.
Drawback.
Yeah, sounds like some kind of discount.
Okay.
But I'm guessing it's not that simple.
It's a bit more complex, yeah. Think of it this way. You import steel from Canada, right? To build a boat.
Fancy boat.
You pay import taxes on that steel when it comes in.
Okay.
But then you sell that boat to someone in Europe, ship it out.
Ah.
Section 313 says you can get a drawback.
Bullshit.
Basically a refund on the taxes you paid because the steel left the country.
Like getting your money back on ingredients you didn't end up using.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Important for businesses doing global stuff.
Like boat building.
Yeah. They import materials, assemble them here, then export. Drawbacks help them stay competitive. No double taxing on materials.
Smart.
Right.
Okay, drawbacks. It's like a global trade hack. But thinking about all this importing and exporting,
Yeah.
it makes me think, how does the U.S. actually make sure all this trade is running smoothly and fairly?
Right. Well, that's where trade facilitation and enforcement come in.
Okay.
All these measures, some to keep trade flowing
Yeah.
and some to make sure everyone's playing by the rules.
So it's like a balancing act. Make it easy for businesses to move stuff around, but also prevent illegal imports or, cheating.
Exactly. It's a two-way street. You've got things like the Importer Declaration Program for softwood lumber
What's that?
helps fight illegal logging.
Okay.
Importers have to say where their wood comes from, makes it harder to sneak in illegal timber.
Makes sense.
Then there's the Safe Port Act.
Sounds serious.
It is about security, but also efficiency. Requires electronic filing of all sorts of import info.
So customs can process everything faster.
Yep. And focus on the risky stuff.
So they're using tech to streamline things and catch the bad guys.
Exactly. Like a high-tech border patrol for the digital age.
I like it.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there's still, the more traditional enforcement methods too.
Oh, absolutely. Section 601 of the Copyright Act, that one makes importing copyright infringing goods illegal.
So like those knockoff designer bags you see.
Those are a no-go. And then you've got agreements like CAFTA-DR focuses on stopping tobacco smuggling
Interesting.
and making sure imported tobacco meets health standards.
It's kind of mind-blowing, all the different stuff these laws cover. It's not just tariffs. It's intellectual property, health, even the environment.
It's all connected and constantly changing as new issues come up.
Speaking of, we touched on those regional trade agreements earlier.
Right.
CBE or ATPA, AGOA, all that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious how they actually work.
Like,
They all aim to help specific regions through trade, but in different ways.
right, exactly. CBERA, the Caribbean Basin one, that's about boosting those economies by giving them better access to the U.S. market.
So their products face lower import taxes, making them cheaper here.
Exactly. It helps stimulate their economies, encourages investment.
Cool. What about ATPA, the Andean one?
That's focused on reducing drug production.
Whoa, using trade to fight drugs.
That's the idea. Give these countries better market access so they can develop other industries, rely less on coca production.
That's pretty innovative. And AGO, the African one.
That's a big one. Duty-free access to the U.S. market for tons of products
Wow.
from eligible African countries.
So helping boost their economies overall.
Yeah, fostering economic growth and development in a region that really needs it.
Sounds like a powerful way to, lift people out of poverty. But does this kind of preferential treatment, does it hurt businesses here?
It's a good question and a constant debate. Critics say it can harm domestic industries, undercutting prices.
Because the imports are cheaper.
Right. Supporters argue it actually benefits the U.S. economy long term.
How so?
By opening up new markets for us and giving American businesses new places to source stuff from.
So it's a trade-off.
It is. With every policy, there are going to be winners and losers.
I guess that's true of everything. But you mentioned something about negligible imports.
Yes. That's where things get interesting again. Basically, if a country's only sending a tiny amount of something to the U.S.,
Like what?
let's say woven baskets. A small island nation exports these baskets, but it's like less than 3% of all the baskets the U.S. imports.
Okay.
They might be considered negligible and get exempt from certain duties or investigations.
So you have like a break for the little guy.
Exactly. Recognizing that their impact on the market's pretty small, they don't need the same level of scrutiny as a huge exporter.
Like a David and Goliath situation.
I like that analogy. But before we move on, I wanted to bring up that 0.21% fee you were asking about.
Oh, yeah. The one from the Consolidated Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act.
That's the one. You were intrigued.
I was. It's so specific. What's the deal with that?
So ad valorem, that just means it's a percentage of the value.
Okay.
Every import pays this tiny fee, 0.21%, to U.S. Customs.
Like a mini toll to bring stuff in.
You got it. And here's the cool part, that money directly funds the Customs Service.
So it's like those little taxes on your phone bill that pay for emergency services.
Exactly. You don't always notice them, but they're crucial. Every time we buy something imported, we're helping, in a tiny way, to keep our borders secure. Which brings up a broader point, the connection between trade law and, things like national security.
Right. We were talking about CAFTA-DR earlier, stopping tobacco smuggling. That's both trade and law enforcement.
Exactly. And then you have sanctions, which use trade restrictions as a foreign policy tool.
Like those on Iran and North Korea.
Yep, they are. Critics say they hurt ordinary people more than the intended targets, and that they might not even work.
So it's a delicate tool to use.
Very much so. But it shows how trade's not just about economics anymore. It's tangled up with security, diplomacy, even human rights.
Wow. Really puts things into perspective.
Right. And speaking of connections, can't forget about Congress and the president.
They're the ones making the trade laws, right?
Exactly. Congress passes the laws, approves agreements, but the president negotiates them.
Sounds like a recipe for conflict.
It can be. We see it all the time. Congress pushing back, interest groups lobbying. It's how policy gets made in a democracy, messy and complicated.
So trade policy, it's not just technical, it's political.
Very much so. And that's why it's important for everyone to be informed, to engage in these discussions.
Because it affects all of us.
Whether we realize it or not. Every time we buy something, we're part of the system, shaped by these laws and agreements.
It's easy to forget how connected we are to all this, Trade regulations, international agreements, it all seems so distant.
But it's not.
No, it's not. Yeah. From clothes to coffee, U.S. trade law touches everything.
And like we've been saying, it's not just about economics anymore. It's the environment, labor rights, security, even human rights. It's a fascinating field, always evolving.
And we'll keep exploring it in our final segment. It really is amazing how much trade law shapes our world.
Yeah.
Even if we don't always realize it, it's there in the background.
It's everywhere, shaping the global economy, the things we buy, everything.
And speaking of things we buy, I was thinking about the history of all this. I mean, these laws didn't just appear overnight, did they? How has U.S. trade law kind of evolved over time?
It's a great question. And you can actually see how American ideas about trade have changed just by looking at these statutes.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Go back to the early 1900s. It was all about protecting American businesses.
I guess that makes sense. The U.S. was still kind of new on the world stage back then, right?
Right. Building up industries. Back then, high tariffs, those taxes on imported goods, that was seen as the way to go.
To shield American companies and workers.
Exactly. And you see that in the Tariff Act of 1930. Remember Section 402?
The one about how they value imports?
Yeah, that whole act was about setting up those import duties, making it expensive to bring stuff in from other countries.
So I bet those made in the USA labels were a lot more common back then, huh?
Yeah.
If importing was pricey, people would buy American?
Absolutely. But as the U.S. economy grew, got more connected globally, things started to change.
People started thinking more about free trade.
Yeah. The idea that opening up to global markets would actually help everyone in the long run.
Because American businesses could sell their stuff overseas, too.
Right. And that's when you start seeing laws like the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. This one gave the president more power to negotiate lower tariffs with other countries.
So like striking deals to make trade easier.
Exactly. That paved the way for a whole bunch of free trade agreements.
So it's like the U.S. realized, being part of the global market, that's where the opportunities are.
For businesses to export, for consumers to get more choices, and cheaper prices.
But I'm guessing it wasn't a simple switch, right? There must have been pushback.
Oh, for sure. There's always that tension between promoting free trade and, protecting what we have here.
Like we were talking about earlier, those programs for developing countries, people worry about losing jobs to foreign competition.
And those worries are valid. It's tough for policymakers balancing free trade with supporting American workers.
It's a tough one.
And you see that struggle reflected in all these laws, like those anti-dumping and countervailing duty things we mentioned.
To make sure foreign companies are playing fair.
Exactly. When free trade starts to hurt American businesses, those are tools they can use to even the playing field.
And then there's all the stuff about labor standards, the environment.
Right. Combating illegal logging, making sure trade agreements include fair labor practices.
It's not just about the bottom line anymore.
No, it's about making sure trade is ethical, sustainable.
It benefits everyone, not just big companies.
Exactly. It's almost like trade law is being used to create a better kind of globalization.
One that's fairer, more responsible, one that considers, the planet and the people.
You said it perfectly. And it makes you wonder, what's next? As the world changes, U.S. trade policy will have to adapt.
What are some of the big things you're keeping an eye on?
Oh, e-commerce is huge. How do you regulate something that's happening online, across borders, instantly?
That's a good question.
Then there's AI, automation. How will that change global supply chains? What's the role of trade law and all that?
And what about climate change? I mean, we're already seeing talk about carbon tariffs, things like that.
Right. It seems like trade law is going to be right at the center of some of the biggest challenges we're facing.
It's a lot to think about. I'll admit, when we started this deep dive, I thought trade law was going to be pretty dry.
I told you it was more interesting than you thought.
You were right. But it's more than just interesting. It's important. It's a way to see the world, Our values, our economy, how we fit into everything.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So what about you, listeners? Anything that surprised you today? Something you want to learn more about? Share your thoughts with us on social media, on our website. We want to hear from you.
And till next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and remember, there's always a new deep dive waiting to be discovered.